Once there was a legion that believed in endurance. Say that sentence softly, as if laying a child's hand upon a sleeping brow. Let it settle like dust in the corner of a great hall. Imagine the words breathing slow and low. Imagine them wrapped in cloth, carried across a cold corridor, and placed beneath the tongue of the galaxy itself. This is the way the story begins, not with thunder or blazing banners, but with a promise made and kept, to endure. Above them, the void unfurled, not empty in the way a room is empty, but quiet and vast, filled with the pale hush between stars. Those stars were patient pinpricks of light, sealing the black like stitches in a tattered garment. They shone through mists of forgotten war, through nebulae that looked like smudges on an old photograph. From a distance, the galaxy could be mistaken, in a moment of soft forgetfulness, for sleep itself. A slow, indifferent breathing where systems rose and fell, where empires blinked and did not stir. Into that slow breathing, the Death Guard moved as if following a path they had always known. They were not loud. They were not swift. They were first and foremost steady. Their ships cut the black with hulls dulled by cosmic frost, their engines humming a low note that matched the pulse of their belief. On deck, the lights were dimmed to a comfortable amber. Even the machines seemed to speak in whispers, approving the quiet discipline of restraint. Once, the men who would become the Death Guard were simply men. They were farmers and scholars, sailors and sons, wearing names and histories like warm cloaks. But names bend in service and cloaks grow heavy with weather. For them, the doctrine of endurance became a creed, a slow, deliberate choice, as given and simple as breathing. It taught that suffering, attended with purpose, was purification, that to stand when all around you fell was a kind of sanctity. So they trained. Long marches beneath iron skies, nights spent with frost in the beard, days of repeated drills until the muscles remembered not how to complain. In the beginning, their belief was a quiet thing, measured, almost tender. They valued the capacity to withstand. They prized the ability to go on when others would not. They polished their armor until it gleamed like prayers and learned the weight of silence. They learned, too, the songs of waiting, the soft cadence of boots upon metal, the subtle rhythm of a respirator inhaling and exhaling in a long, disciplined line. There is a kind of beauty to such restraint. It looks from a certain angle almost holy. Imagine, if you will, a wide plain at dusk, the wind lifting the surface of a ruined field in slow, balletic waves, and a formation standing like quiet stones. They do not move because they must. They do not shout because they can be heard. Their discipline is a lullaby for the galaxy's restless heart. We will remain. We will not be moved. And yet even the most patient story contains the first small shadow. On the homeworld of these men, Barbarus, the shadow had the shape of a cough. Barbarus was not a gentle place. It was a world wrapped in fog and ancient wrongness, a planet that had been cruelly cast before a forge and left to cool in poisoned rain. Its skies were not blue, but the color of old metal left too long in the sun, the sheen of old iron and the bruise of cloud. The ground smelled of iron filings and something sweeter, like rotting fruit pressed into a wound. Trees grew there with bark like petrified skin. Their leaves were mottled and damp, and when they fell they sank into the sod and never quite disappeared. Rain on Barbarus did not refresh. It came with a hissing that sounded like small stones being thrown into a kettle. Sometimes it was thin, like a whisper drawn across the face of the planet. Sometimes it fell thick and sour, the droplets tasting of metal and salt. Rain on armor became a familiar music, a soft percussion that the men learned to read like scripture. They would stand beneath it and not flinch. They took in the acid drizzle and learned to carry its sting the way you might carry a memory, close to the skin, always present, but not yet overwhelming. In those days the fog was company. It curled between the trunks and filled the valleys with a slow, gray breath. When the men walked through it, it wrapped their cloaks and chilled the exposed skin of their faces. Inside the fog there were sounds that might have been animals, might have been wind, might have been something older. At night, when the fires were out and the tasks of the day had been performed with the quiet efficiency of ritual, the fog would press at their boots like a tide. From within it came tiny, unnameable noises, a scraping, a faint double note of something rasping over stone. They learned to ignore those sounds because endurance, more than sensation, had become their lodestar. Then there was Mortarion. He was introduced not with a trumpet but with a silhouette. Even now, as the tale is told in a hush, the image of him comes first as a shape, tall, wrapped in a great coat of gray that seemed to drink the light. His face, if it could be called a face, was pale in the way of things kept out of sunlight. His eyes were deep reservoirs, and his breath, when he drew it, sounded like distant wind through a ruined tower. He walked among the legion like a slow shadow, and when he spoke the sound folded into the air like smoke. Mortarion had been different once, the stories say. Once he had been a prince of his world, a stubborn child among soot, a leader who prized the hard clarity of truth. But time and the harshness of Barbarus carved him into something quieter. He became a man who could bear silence the way others bore arms. Where other leaders sought to inflame and inspire, he ceded steadiness and stubbornness. His rhetoric was never loud. It was the sort that sank beneath the skin and set the bones to cooling. "Endure," he told them, "and we will be unbroken." That word, unbroken, he wrapped around his people like a promise. They listened. They learned. They baptized themselves in the coldness of the world and forged a doctrine from it. Endurance through pain, strength through decay. It was not a crude slogan, but a lattice of belief. To endure was to accept the slow wearing of self, to find within that wearing a honing rather than a hollowing. Decay, in their way, was an ally. If a blade is kept too pristine, it may be brittle. If a mind never learns to let go, it will break under sudden strain. They taught one another to accept the small losses, to let the edges soften in practice so that the core would remain. This philosophy made them stern but compassionate in a peculiar style. They did not seek out suffering, they accepted it. They would rather hold a wound and let it teach them than deny pain and be undone when the night came. So they drilled until the muscles had no need of thought. They meditated until the mind became a slow metronome. They learned to be patient with the body's betrayals, with the coughing that sometimes began and never seemed to end, with the small, stubborn fevers that burned like lanterns at the edge of consciousness. Imagine for a moment the quiet of a barracks at dawn on Barbarus. The men rise without fuss. Metal doors open and release a gentle sigh like exhalation. The air is close, full of the distant smell of damp wood and hot oil. Boots find floorboards, a soft percussion like the counting of a prayer. There is the distant echo of voices reciting lists of maintenance tasks, and the rustling of cloth as men strap on armor that fits like a second skin. The rain drums on the sheets of metal overhead, a slow and steady hand, and for a while everything is measured and safe. Within that safety, seeds can grow unnoticed. They came as small things, a persistent tick in a joint, a persistent cough that did not want to leave after the fever had gone, a patch of skin that hung slightly loose where before it had been taut. At first these were nuisances, the sort of thing veteran soldiers learned to accept. "Patch it," a comrade would say. "Keep marching." They patched and marched. They stitched and carried on. They fashioned poultices of folded cloth and salted bandages. They sang the old grinding songs and told jokes that were thin as paper. The laughter was sometimes brittle, but it held up the night. And still, small things spread. A purse of fluid beneath a shoulder joint. A strange warmth that passed under the plates of an armored gauntlet. A whisper in the fog that was not quite a voice and not quite wind. A child who had learned to sleep through any storm would have thought it only the world sighing, but a careful ear might have noticed the change. A cadence altered, like a metronome slightly off-tempo. Those who are careful in listening will tell you that the first whisper was not cruel. The whisper spoke of patience, of time as salve of release. "Endure," it said. "There is no shame in being carried." At first it was like the murmur of a distant crowd. Later it became intimate as breath at the nape of a neck. It promised relief, a softer path through the terrible grind of existence. The men, who had been taught that endurance was virtue, heard in it not temptation but counsel. There is a peculiar mercy to the slow acceptance of an illness. It wraps itself in the rhythms of the body and learns the small ways you take comfort. The Death Guard, by their training, were especially vulnerable to that mercy. They had practiced the art of making peace with pain. They had built rituals around stoicism. So when the whisper came, it fit into their practices the way a new pattern fits into an old cloth. It suggested modifications to their disciplines. A longer watch, a prayer offered differently, an ointment applied in sacred rhythm. They adjusted. They kept moving. Barbarus, meanwhile, kept its fog. The planet exhaled and refolded its mists into valleys like blankets. The forest stayed damp and low. Trees shed their leaves, and those leaves dissolved into the soil with a soft, almost approving sound. The rain licked the armor edges and left green-black smears like ink. In the mornings, there would be a faint smell along the wind, sweet and sharp together, and some veterans would stop and close their eyes and breathe it in like a benediction. It smelled of decay, of earth turned back to itself, and to them it became, in a frighteningly small way, comforting. On the decks of their ships, far from Barbarus, the pattern continued. The hum of the engines warmed the plates beneath their feet. Men woke and coughed into cupped hands, and then resumed their duties with a measured expression, as if carrying an old, familiar tool. The line between sickness and ritual blurred. Dressing a wound became an act of meaning rather than mere maintenance. A cough might be answered with a phrase from doctrine as easily as with a medic strip. Because endurance had been their chosen shelter, the men did not recoil from the slow changes in their bodies. They learned instead to interpret them as proof of their commitment. The body slow, yielding a sign of discipline, sacrifice given over to the greater order. This reinterpretation is the first step on many roads. It is where choice and fate meet and are, for a moment, indistinguishable. Even here, before the rot was named, before the green bloom crossed throat and hand, there existed a quality both tragic and beautiful, the strange dignity of a people who had decided to accept their weaknesses rather than deny them. There was an honor in the way they held their wounds and talked of them. There was warmth in the mutual care they showed, in the quiet hands that bound a friend's arm, in the shared trays of thin broth passed among them by the light of a single bulb. Love survives in many shapes. Among the Death Guard it lived as steady attention. And yet the whisper persisted. It grew not loud but intimate. It threaded into the cadence of their prayers and the rhythm of their work. Sometimes it came as a memory. A child on Barbarus hearing rain for the first time, and the adult mind recalling that small, vital shock. Sometimes it arrived as sensation, a piece of armor gone suddenly clammy as if something warm had brushed beneath it. The whisper never shouted. It did not need to. It had time. It had the deliberate patience of something that knows endurance better than any single human could. By then the Legion had already become more than men and less than myth. Their creed, endurance through pain, strength through decay, had ripened into a worldview and a practice. They believed not in sudden victories, but in a slow mastery. They found holiness in the habitual making of one foot in front of the other, in the small mercies of a day completed. It is easy to admire such steadiness and to mistake it for unassailable strength. It is easy, in the lull before anything terrible is named, to believe that the world will always remain merely a place where men make their choices and carry on. But even the calmest narratives contain the first hint of storm. In the Death Guard's story, that hint was small and soft as a cough, and it came in the very place that disciplined endurance touched the limits of human patience. The body. Listen now for the faintest of cues, the rain striking metal, the echo of a boot in mud, the soft, steady intake and release of breath. Beneath that calm breathing there is another sound, barely audible, like the rolling of a tiny pebble inside a jar. It is the rattle of something settling in the lungs. It is nothing yet, and it is everything. The story has started, but not with a blaze. It has begun as a slow taking of measure, a clock set in motion whose hands will, in time, move with terrible deliberation. Hold that thought. Keep your hands warm. Let the whisper of the tale lay across your awareness like a soft cloth. There is comfort in the knowledge of what comes next. Endurance, first and always, and perhaps the price of that endurance hidden in the fog. There was a time when Mortarion's voice was not an abyss but a clear instruction, given with the simple certainty of the man who has seen frost and decided, with a practical patience, how best to live with it. He spoke like one who had measured the cold and chosen habits to outlast it. No flourish, no fire. A minimalism of speech that cut away drama and left only the bone of purpose. No weakness, he would say. No gods. Only will. It sounded like doctrine because it was. It read like a map for survival. And the men who listened took it in as if they had been waiting for such a map their whole lives. Mortarion's philosophy was not born of bluster. It came from the long winters and the thin foods of Barbarus. It came from trenches that never thawed and harvests that required patience measured in seasons rather than hours. He taught them the virtue of attrition. That strength accrued not through bursts of glory but through the slow accumulation of unbroken days. If you can stand through a storm, he argued, then storms will stop mattering. If you can take a wound and not let it decide you, then wounds lose their terror. The soul, he suggested, could be treated like a vessel that must be thickened, not polished. A container made heavy and trustworthy rather than light and brittle. There is a certain nobility to such thinking. It shapes a people who do not seek the grand, but who prize the quotidian as sacred. They learn ceremonies for the small acts of maintenance, the careful oiling of joints, the ritualized tightening of straps, the deliberate inhalation and exhalation at the beginning and end of each watch. The narrative of greatness becomes daily routine. A life of small, steady sacrifices begins to feel like an altar. Before the heresy, before the warp's contamination and the windows of the world began to open, the Death Guard were, in their austere way, pure. Purity does not mean absence of darkness. It means fidelity to a principle. Their principle was endurance. They would be strong because they would not refuse the world's pressure. They would let it press them into form until they became unbreakable. In that purity, there was a strange tenderness. The comradeship born of shared trial, the quiet jokes told in the lee of a storm, the hands that bound one another's wounds with slow, deliberate care. They believed themselves an ark of sorts, a living bulwark against the suddenness of ruin. They would not be overturned by the chaotic flares of war because they had built a temperament immune to flashes. They practiced a kind of ceremonial loneliness. When the rest of the galaxy sought spectacle and speed, they walked in unhurried lines, their armor worn not to impress but to last. Their faces grew lined and patient, mouths set into the habitual expression of people who had learned to hold back tears until the taut moment. Love, when it existed, was expressed not in abrupt declarations but in long, practical attentions. Extra rations saved for a friend, blankets polished and mended with a particular care. The slow making of certain a comrade's breathing was steady before turning in. This was their beauty, and it made them vulnerable. For the first weakness did not arrive as a catastrophe but as a metaphor, the soul stiffening, the breath shortening. It began as a change in cadence, not in content. A veteran who had stood through a dozen sieges noticed that the prayers said at dawn and dusk had the same words but a slightly different rhythm. The drills were performed with the same movements but fewer exclamations, as if air had become more precious and speech a luxury. Men who once woke with an inner spark now rose like censers, everything measured, everything economical. Endurance had asked for more of them than they had first realized, and they, as always, complied. There were other signs on the body, on the senses, that no creed could explain away. The stench of rust that seemed to hang a half-second longer in the air. The taste of copper at the edges of the mouth after a long watch, as if the metal of their world had found its way into their blood. And always, in the distance or perhaps at the edge of one's own vision, a sickly green glow that belonged to no simple lantern, and which the eyes adjusted to like a constant faint afterimage. Men would glance at one another and see, in those astigmatic seconds, the same pallor and the same small sheen on the skin, like oil on water. These were not the items of doctrine, they were the slow handwriting of a sickness. Mortarion, who had taught them to trust will above all, met these changes in the only way he knew, with cataloging, with rules, with ritual. He asked for reports. He set aside medics. He instituted procedures. If a soldier coughed twice before watch, a notation was made. If a joint swelled, it was padded and supported, and the march continued. List the replies to the infection, he told his captains, not with hysteria, but with the same plainness he had always used. If we call it by a name, we can give it a place. Naming it in his mind meant containing it. To be human under his doctrine was to reduce surprise, to take the infinite particulars of life and fold them into a predictable, workable whole. The problem with names, especially in a galaxy where words have teeth, is that some things refuse to be folded. The forces that like to wear smiles at the edges of meaning reach their fingers into those neat lists. Whispers, the soft, indulgent sort that promise rest, brushed against the edges of Mortarion's logic. They did not shout. They suggested. There is no need to fight the slow, they said. There is an easier way. The temptation of an easier way can be a mercy and a trap. The whispers of Nurgle do not rush. They speak in the vocabulary of respite, comfort in rot, release in decay. To men schooled to respect suffering, such suggestions were paradoxically sweet. The whispers promised endurance without teeth, a condition that would not demand endless vigilance but would fold itself into the marrow and make a man immune to the petty vicissitudes of fortune. Imagine, the whisper seemed to say, a state where cuts sealed not with pain but with a slow, restorative crust, where the body was not a battleground but a garden tended by kindly hands. For a people who had learned to harvest their days for virtue, the language of relief was a language of worship. At first, the whispers were metaphors turned inward. Let the wound teach you, they seemed to murmur, and soldiers would repeat the phrase as if it were scripture. But metaphors have edges, and edges catch. The next steps were not metaphorical but sensory. The smell of rust became more than an olfactory stubbornness. It became a presence that lingered in the throat. It became the odor of the air around a man whose marrow was changing. The taste of copper grew from a flicker after a night's watch to a permanent ledger that the mouth could not forget. The green glow, at first distant as aurora, spread like a bruise beneath the skin, seen in reflections on the cold metal of a visor. A soldier saw his reflection and thought the film on the glass was dirt. He wiped it and the film remained, not on the glass but within. Bodies changed in the small, intimate ways that once would have been treated immediately. A finger pad thickening here, a patch of skin loosened there. Armor, which had always been a trusted outer self, began to behave differently. Plates that had been snug and cool at dawn grew warm by the second watch, as if something beneath them had turned to gentle heat. Then the plates became damp, not with external drizzle, but with a seeping that came from within, as if the man and his armor had swapped secrets. The material that had been his defense now became an interface, breathable not in the old clever engineering sense, but in the sense of living tissue and living metal exchanging moisture and memory. Perhaps the strangest early sign was the absence of heartbeat for some. A warrior, once used to tracking his pulse with casual fingers, might find only a slow, distant drum where there had been a quick, steady percussion. He would be unnerved but unalarmed because his training taught him to trust the march rather than the pulse. "We are steady," they would say to one another. That is all. And yet beneath the steady language there was an internal silence where life used to throb. It felt to many like a quieting of the soul as much as the body, a lowering of a volume knob somewhere deep in the ribcage. Men who had once rallied by clapping one another on the back and feeling the quick, mortal thump now touched one another and found a muted cavern where heat should have been. Those who cared for the wounded told different stories. They spoke of armor that exhaled. The metal would, they said, give a small pneumatic sigh when the man slept, a soft settling that mimicked respiration. Medics would tighten seals and find not the clean, dry folds of old textile, but a faintly warm tackiness beneath. It was as if the machines and the muscles had agreed on a single voice. In the dim light of the sickbay, someone might watch the visor fog in the pattern of a breath and think, for a half-second, that the man within was smiling. And always the whisper, "You need not struggle anymore." It was delivered like a lullaby, lowercase and intimate. It did not ridicule the old values. Rather, it folded them into a new grammar. Endurance was admirable, but endurance under the gentle care of change was superior. The whisper promised a sanctified complacency. It invited men to close their eyes, to stop the constant rechecking of straps and bolts, to let the muscles soften into a complacent vigilance. If Mortarion had taught them to add layers of habit to shield against crisis, the whisper offered them a state in which crisis was smoothed into habit by forces beyond human effort. The tragedy is that their virtues, those very mechanisms designed to protect, made them fertile ground for corruption. A people committed to patience will allow a small wrong to go unremarked in the belief that time will correct it. A people who prize the wisdom of the wound will find it easy to allow a friendly sore to be seen as sacred. The death guard, who had crafted endurance into theology, folded the whisper into liturgy, the way a priest folds a visitor's cloak around shivering shoulders. If you believe that to suffer is to form character, then an infection that promises to discipline the body will be mistaken for a teacher. Inside this slow transformation is a particular kind of sorrow. It is not the sudden, dramatized fall of a hero betrayed by fate. It is something quieter, the watching of small concessions until a life is remade. There are moments that later become talismans in the telling. The private confusion of a man who cannot feel his heartbeat, the hands that pause at an armored plate that seems to shudder like a living thing, the medic who learns to say, "There is comfort in the same breath as we must not yield." They keep their rituals, they keep their inspections. They simply allow the inspections to find the changes, and then name those changes as authorized. The process is consensual in a way that makes it all the more grievous. Mortarion, for all his austerity, did not see his doctrine contradicted easily. He catalogued and he measured, and he leaned upon the only tools he trusted: list, order, ritual. When the whisper became chorus, when the changes became widespread, the attempts to resist were methodical rather than melodramatic. Commissions were formed, observers were posted, but Mortarion's own rhetoric, "No weakness, no gods, only will," could be read two ways. To hold to will could mean to resist any softening force that promised ease. It could also mean to accept any alteration if it was endured with a certain mannered calm. The lexicon of endurance is porous. Words admit translations. He had taught them to be steady under pressure. The pressure taught them to be patient with the pressure. There is an elegiac quality to watching a people be transformed by what they once called virtue. It is not merely the loss of flesh or the softening of muscle. It is the corruption of meaning. A man who once tightened his belt as a practice of discipline will, under the whisper's tutelage, see that tightening become a ceremony evoking a pleasure in the endurance itself. The ritual takes on a charm of its own, and what was an exercise in vigilance becomes an embrace of a new state. In the middle stages of this change, one meets, repeatedly, a certain paradoxical expression on the faces of those affected, a serenity layered onto surprise. They move with the old memorized steps and yet with an ease that seems almost like grace. They speak of their symptoms as if they were virtues. "I cough," they say, and the cough becomes a hymn. "My hand grows loose in its socket," they confess, and the looseness becomes proof of humility before fate. The language of suffering becomes the language of devotion. The men mean it sincerely, and therein lies the sting. There is no villain with a burning brand. There is a people giving themselves, willingly and lovingly, to a slow, quiet thing that promises to keep them steady. The small sensory horrors are the most intimate. Imagine the metal of a gauntlet turning gentle heat against the wrist, like the palm of a hand. Imagine the smell of rust not as an external environmental note, but as a perfume that clings to the skin. Imagine the inside of a helmet, usually a cool nest of machinery, becoming moist in the way a cave might condense its breath. The visor fogs, patterns form like the sketch of a cloud, and when the man wipes it away with a finger, the fog returns from within. Imagine that the music of a formation, the metrical march, begins to sound as if the instruments themselves are breathing slowly in unison with the bodies they contain. This is not ghastly in the instantaneous, scream-inducing sense. It is grotesque in the domestic way. A kettle that suddenly begins to sing a different song, a familiar room that has changed its paint. It is like grief that dines with you and talks in a quiet voice about the weather. The Death Guard respond with their own version of love, a steady, methodical care that has become indistinguishable from collusion. And still, in the quiet corners, resistance simmers. Not massive rebellions, but small acts. An extra tightening of a strap by a hand who remembers the old shock of pain. A whispered prohibition against certain rites performed in the sacred sickbay. A scrap of paper passed between two brothers in arms with a notation of the things they must not forget. These acts are valiant in their modesty. They are gestures of remembering, tokens of a past life offered like small coins to buy back a memory. The tragedy of the Death Guard's fall is not that they were ever evil. It is that their strength became the loom upon which a darker fabric was woven. Mortarion, who had taught them to shun gods and rely on will alone, saw his people bend toward a different master, not by force but by an almost tender invitation. The creed that had once promised unbrokenness had paradoxically made them susceptible to a systematic remaking, because unbrokenness takes for its scaffolding the willingness to take the slow weight of change. At the end of this chapter of their lives, before the full flowering of what would later be called the plague, there was a long, mournful interval in which men still looked like men, in which the rituals continued, and in which the medics still moved with hands that tried to repair. Yet each stitch was a stitch into new flesh. Each ointment held unknown chemistry. Each prayer kept its old words but meant something subtly adjusted. The world smelled of rust and copper and something green and sweet, like the first overripe fig. They spoke of endurance with the same tenderness as a lover smoothing a blanket, and underneath the tenderness lay a quiet, inexorable yielding. If you stand back and watch, what you will see is not violence but a slow, continuous reorientation. The men do not scream. Their faces settle into a sorrowful acceptance. They have been taught that endurance is virtue, and they are virtuous in a way that is dreadful. They have become the stewards of a faith that will, in time, demand more than the long view of a battle. It will demand the surrender of histories, the renaming of childhood tastes, the redefinition of what it means to be human. This is the heart of their tragedy, to have built a cathedral of patience and handed its keys to a thing that knits comfort and decay into one seamless garment. Mortarion's maxim, no weakness, no gods, only will, remains, but it is read now through lenses fogged by a green light. The will still exists, but it is accompanied by a softening, as if the iron of resolve has been annealed into something more malleable. They endure, and in enduring they are remade. Listen then to the soft cadence of their lives, the ritual tightening of straps, the careful swapping of rations, the breath that lengthens and then shortens, the cough that is crooned like a song. Here too, beneath those sounds, a different timbre, the whisper that promises a certain ease, the rust that hangs like a benediction in the air, the taste of copper every time a man takes a breath. These are the instruments of a slow conversion. You do not see the final stage yet. You stand instead at the edge of an elegy. The men are still human enough to dream of returning to fields and faces, to sunsets that have a color other than the greenish bruise that now edges their sky. They keep their old stories warm like coals under ash. But beneath that warmth there is something growing, patient as a root, waiting to twist the very soil of their souls. They had sailed into the warp as if into sleep, a long, measured crossing, engines tuned to a frequency that hummed through bone. At first the passage was ordinary in the way the Black Sea can be ordinary. Star maps traced in the dark, course corrections logged in neat hand, the mechanical breathing of reactors a lullaby beneath the hull. The Death Guard moved within that lullaby like moths around a warm lamp, patient and purposeful. Their armor flashed dull in the dim corridors. Hands were steady where hands must be steady. Voices, when they rose, were careful and small. Storms in the warp are not fireworks. They do not strike like lightning on a summer field. They arrive as pressure changes on a slow, cosmic scale, a shifting of tides in a sea no single eye will ever see. At first it is merely a sensation, subtle and liable to be ignored. A shiver of the controls, a calibration that requires more attention than usual. Lights that have always been true will falter, and a panel that once stayed cool will hum a fraction higher. The crew make notes. Technicians blink into their instruments and adjust, like men resetting a clock. Stand by microcorrection. Someone reports through a throat already used to dry speech. The ship answers with the soft latency of machinery that has known 1,000 such nights. Then, imperceptibly, the hum alters its note. The engines take on a frequency that suggests more than engineering, something older and with taste. A faint smell slips its way into the ventilation. Not yet a stench, but a suggestion of iron and old gardens, the scent of a place where water has sat too long. It moves along the ducts with the patient inevitability of weather. Sensors chart a slight rise in airborne particulates. Medics mark the change and note it down with the habitual detachment of those trained to classify the world rather than fear it. Minor irritant, a doctor might say, and apply a routine filter. The notation goes into a ledger. The ledger is folded into a report. But reports are a kind of denial. They transform the immediate into the manageable. The men, who have always trusted procedure, accept the ledger and continue their rounds. They tighten buckles, they check seals, they run diagnostics. The decks, once gleaming with antiseptic care, begin to gather a sheen of condensation that the lights catch and make into muted constellations. Metal cools and warms in undulant waves. The condensation roots itself in corners and under hinges like a slow, pale moss. It beads on visors and runs in thin streams along the seams of armor. Where two plates meet, micro-etchings begin to show, tiny pitting that the polishing cloth cannot erase. Corrosion is patient. Corrosion does not hurry. The ship's life support systems, which have always been a chorus of humming regulators and measured ventilation, begin to acquire a different resonance. The low, omnipresent hum deepens as if the ship itself were inhaling something unfamiliar and holding it for a long, thoughtful time. Pumps thud with a weightier rhythm. Filters clack in a manner that sounds like a throat clearing. Men awake from watch and find the air to be a touch thicker than it should be, a texture to each breath that tastes of iron. At first the coughs are polite, quiet, single notes that are dealt with by the medics and dismissed as the residue of long hours and recycled air. But the coughing grows in number. It becomes a far distant chorus that hangs under the other sounds of the ship, a background like a remembered storm. Once the coughs start, they do not stop easily. They ripple through bunk bays like soft waves. The soundscape of the vessel becomes layered. Above it, the steady click of footfalls and the murmur of maintenance. Beneath it, the wet, persistent cough that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere. Men awake at the edge of sleep thinking their throats are parched, but water will not fix it. Sleep brings no restoration. They rise and strap metal to flesh, and in the mirror the skin around a mouth is a few shades sallow, and a film clings to the inside of the visor like dawn mist. In that mist, the armor begins to feel wrong. Where it had been cold and neutral, plates take a slow warmth, as if the metal had decided to become more companion than barrier. The gauntlets that once snapped crisply into place ease, and beneath a cuff a trickle collects, warm and viscous, like sweat where none should be. Men bend to check their palms and find the seam between flesh and machine to be less an edge than a wet handshake. They run a rag along the inside of a collar, and the rag comes away threaded with a faint, oil-like film that smells of metallic blossoms and old water. It would be easy, at first, to mistake these sensations for the familiar fatigue of long voyages. The human mind is efficient at making adjustments, at normalizing the abnormal. Discipline trains you to disregard the irregular for the sake of function. The Death Guard had, after all, built one of their faiths on the notion that persistence reduces surprise. Keep steady, and the universe simplifies. Yet there is a qualitative difference between the mechanical wear of a ship and the intimate, sticky creep of something that colonizes the interface between man and metal. The latter insinuates itself, and in doing so changes more than an exterior. A subtle and sickly green light begins, too. At first a remote phenomenon caught in reflection off a viewport, a color that the eye dismisses as aberrant. Later it leaks into the corners of rooms like a persistent afterimage. Visors, once perfectly clear, pick up a faint film of this hue that refuses to buff out. Medics examine samples and note quasi-organic compounds in the condensate. Instruments that have always trusted their calibration now make notations in a dry, mechanical hand. Anomalous, biotic chemical signature present. The words sit in the log like the first white stone laid in a cairn, a naming of presence. And then there are the dreams. The sleep of the crew, which had been an efficient cycle of rotation and rest, alters in character. Where dreams had once been short and functional, snapshots of drills or remembered faces, they lengthen into slow, viscous tapestries. Men recount waking with images of endless rain, a sky without horizon where water moved like a curtain, always on the verge of touch. In the dream, the rain does not cleanse, it dwells. It settles like silt in the throat. In the dream, loved faces become swollen and glossy, as if seen through a film. A brother-in-arms may appear with softened features and a faintly open mouth, and the dreamer wakes with a hand that trembles when it reaches to the pillow, as if to close that mouth tight. The dreams do their own kind of work. They fold the waking into the sleeping until the two are difficult to separate. A footstep on deck will bring a flash of wet leaves. A whisper from a vent will bring a remembered voice saying, "You asked for endurance, I gave it to you." The whisper is not malevolent at first. It is the voice of a patient nurse, the cadence of a lullaby. It answers the yearning already cultivated by doctrine. I will keep you from falling. As the physical symptoms progress, the psychological shifts that accompany them lurch quietly into place. Men who once prided themselves on quick reflexes now move with a slowness that has the flavor of deliberation, not of fatigue. Their faces smooth into an expression that could be read as peace, except the peace is underlaid by something like dim resignation. The words they use change. Where once the language of recovery and repair predominated, now the words allow and let appear in conversation. A junior officer who once barked orders recites instead a measured phrase taught by a medic. Do not fight the change. It is medicine. The phrase is spoken with the authority of liturgy. The medics, specialized and competent, are confounded in ways that go beyond instrumentation. They read charts and find markers that resemble infection, but also something else entirely. Signals usually associated with long-term adaptation. Tissues that should be dry are turgid. Cells show signs of metabolic rewiring, as if the body has reconstituted its priorities. Wounds close in ridged, patterned crusts that do not scar like scars, but like carefully arranged seams. The medics speak in the low language of those who hold other people's lives. It is like the body remembers another world. They patch, they bathe, they chant procedural advice, but there is too often a look in their eyes that is not merely professional concern. It is a small grief. They are trained to heal. They are not trained to reconcile patients to becoming. Of all the transformations, perhaps the most disquieting is how pain itself reframes. Pain is the body's alarm, the insistence that something is wrong. Among the death guard, pain begins to dull, not vanishing, but changing into a thin, flat cord that lacks its old urgency. Where once a man would have pulled away at the prickle of a blade or the burn of chemical, now he breathes slowly and tells himself it is a test. The habit of endurance functions like a buffer to anesthetize reaction. In that buffer, a perverse comfort grows. Men discover a strange pleasure in the absence of panic, a soothing that tells them the world is less likely to surprise them now. The more the fear drains, the more the acceptance hardens into faith, and all the while the soundscape shifts. The distant coughing becomes a rhythm, a kind of low, communal chant. When men walk in formation, the coughs punctuate the step like a metronome. There is also the sloshing, an embarrassing, intimate sound that one hears when a man turns, and something unseen shifts beneath armor plates. It is as if vessels inside them have begun to host their own weather. The slosh is private and public at once. It announces itself in a corridor and carries an intimacy that makes casual conversation awkward. Soldiers in passing will glance at one another and see the evidence. A discoloration at the sleeve seam, a patch of damp. Faces will be a study in small adjustments. A hand that reaches without a thought to press a gauntlet flat against a seam. A medic who coughs and looks away. Mechanical chanting emerges as an anchor. Where traditions once relied on spoken oaths and shouted commands, now those same words are reduced to machine-like repetition, a comfort in redundancy. We endure, we endure. The chant is not violent, it is a mantra. Its repetitions act like straps, binding an unsteady mind to a steady cadence. The sound carries through the vents, the dampened corridors, the sickbay. It becomes a soundtrack to waking. Men chant it into their cupped hands. They whistle it under their breath while tightening bolts. It is a syllabic salve. Yet beneath the chant there is an inversion. The sentence that began as a vow to resist change becomes, in the mouths of the changed, a testament to surrender. We endure transfigures into we are made to endure, and then into we have been made to endure. The voice of agency begins to dim, and with it goes the definition of choice. When a man who once led a squad of veterans now replies to the whisper, not with resistance but with a soft, approving yes, something fundamental has shifted. The voice inside him that once guarded tradition has either been negotiated with or claimed. There are small rebellions that flicker like moths along a lamp. A veteran pins a scrap of cloth into his armor that bears the image of a field at dusk, a reminder of childhood. Another sews a whisper of their mother's name into an undershirt. These acts are modest, private, sometimes foolish. They are the final stubbornness of memory. But memory, if starved, turns brittle. Men clutch at old phrases and find their mouths producing new ones with the solemnity of rites. Do not fear the garden. The decay is gentle. The phrases are adopted, not merely recited. The psychological horror grows not as spectacle but as a slow compression. It flattens the day into a narrower range of acceptable feeling. The comfort of compliance, the hollow pride of being able to withstand any wound, and the numbing hush where curiosity once lay. A man might find himself standing at a viewport for a long time, watching a sea of green clouds roll by, and feel a swelling in his chest that he cannot name. Sometimes he will cry without realizing why, and the tears taste of metal. Perhaps worst of all is the social reinforcement. The Legion, by design, rewards the stoic. Men who do not flinch are admired. When the whisper starts to ask for acceptance and the medics to adjust their protocols, the group dynamic nudges each individual toward accommodation. The tape that marks the boundary between the possible and the forbidden begins to fray. Practices that would once have been dismissed as heretical begin, under the small pressures of group consensus, to become approved. A medic who once argued for isolation and strict quarantine now suggests controlled exposure with a placid face. The change feels inevitable because it is wrapped in familiar language: care, adaptation, endurance. As the internal weather worsens, so does the outer. Warp storms in their true form become visible, ripples of purple and green crossing the void like bruises on the face of night. Instrument panels flicker and for a moment display visions, fragmented and personal, of homeworlds and childhoods, then recede. Men see their pasts like flares and reach without thinking to touch the light with gloved fingers. The ship seems to answer with a deeper, more resonant cough. Somewhere in the belly of the vessel, an old bell that once rang to mark the changing of shifts tolls in a slow, wet manner. The sound is not clear, but it is persistent, like a heartbeat gone wrong. And in that wrongness, the true horror of intimacy reveals itself. This is not horror at the scale of armadas or shattered planets. It is horror in the small. The knowledge that the person who once punched code into a console now hums to himself, while stitching a wound that will not heal in the old way. The feeling of a hand slipping into yours and finding a skin that yields like softened leather. It is seeing a dear friend through the fog of wards and realizing that the friend's voice is softer, their jokes flatter, their eyes glossed over as if behind a film of condensation. You could still call them by their name. The name fits, but you would not mistake them for what you once understood them to be. There are moments of clarity, brief and sharp, where the original creed flashes back into view like a clear pattern beneath smudged paint. Men remember Mortarion's austere syllables. No weakness, no gods, only will. And for a breath they feel the old surge of resistance. They tighten their jaw, clamp a hand onto a rail, and repeat an old order of drills out loud to force the muscles into memory. This is the most painful point of the slow transformation. The collision between remembered agency and present acquiescence. They taste their decision in their mouths like copper, and they are unsure whether the taste is memory or contaminant. Frequently, there is a whispered consolation. Sometimes it is a voice in a vent. Sometimes it is a medic who hums the old cadence with new words. Twice, in the dark of the sickbay, a man has claimed to see a small, luminous garden blooming within a pool of something wet. He insists the sight was gentle and kind, and that it wrapped him like a blanket. The description is given in the same tone one uses to describe a lullaby, yet the sight dissolves in daylight. The man cannot reproduce it under any observation. He smiles then when someone touches his shoulder and takes a breath that is louder than usual. "They gave me a garden," he whispers, and the words fall like seeds. As the chapter of slow unraveling deepens, the moral contours begin to soften. Where previously a wound meant battle and a scar spoke of history, now wounds are recast as badges of initiation into a new order. Men who would once have been horrified at the thought of infection now draw a kind of stern pride from it. Proof that they have been humbled and made resilient. Proof, even, that they have been privileged to carry a burden most others cannot. This inversion is perhaps the cruelest. The transformation of suffering into a status symbol, a grotesque coronation of endurance. When the whisper finally becomes articulate, when the voice is no longer a trickle but a diction in chorus, its phrasing is not alien. It uses their words. It says, softly and with the measured gentleness of a teacher, "You asked for endurance, I gave it to you." There is no malice in that sentence, nor need there be. The horror is that the sentence is true in more ways than one. They had indeed asked to be steadfast. They had transmuted the desire for unwavering strength into a faith. The gift offered in return is a perfection of the faith's terms. Endurance without vulnerability, a kind of immortality that trades agency for persistence. The ship's corridors are no longer sterile. They are damp, lined with the slow bloom of corrosion that catches the dim light and makes it seem alive. Boots slip in puddles that were not there before. The life support hums a song it was not meant to sing, and men move to it as to a metronome that counts not only time but a new liturgy. The coughs form a strange chorus. The mechanical chant, "We endure, we endure," become not just an affirmation but a backdrop to living. It rings through the vents and into the crannies of thought. The early horror is not the end. It is the opening of a gate. It leaves the reader, or the listener, with the residue of damp on the tongue and the scent of iron at the back of the throat. It plants the suggestion that something kind is wrapping itself around the world like a thin, invasive moss. The story is no longer safe in the old way. Its safety has been exchanged for something else. The men who once sought to be unbroken will soon learn that not all that endures is blessing. In the small rooms where lights are kept low and the cold hum is felt like a hand upon the forehead, the men whisper not about tactics but about belonging. They compare symptoms as one might compare medals. They tuck aside small tokens of the old life and fold them into pockets that smell faintly of rust. Sometimes they dream of rain that never washes them clean and wake to find a smear of green along a sleeve. They do not scream. They do not rage. They fold a bandage with the same careful patience with which they button a collar and chant, as if in prayer, "We endure, we endure." And in the wet, near-quiet hours, when only the faintest of lights move across the decks, there is a single voice, a man perhaps near the prow, who stands with his palm to the hull and listens as if to a familiar tune. He hears the ship answer in a low, wet thrum. He thinks, for a split second, of fields not eaten by fog and of children not practiced in silence. He tastes copper, and the taste is not unwelcome. He tastes the metal of his life, and in that flavor he finds, inexplicably, a kind of home. The plague stopped being a secret the way rain stops being a secret when a roof leaks in 100 rooms at once. It was no longer a thing you could tuck into a report or seal behind a bulkhead. It announced itself with a wet, delighted sound, as if something ancient had been unlatched and laughed. The decks that had once kept their distance from the world, metal floors scrubbed to the point of ritual, vents filtered and clean, grew curdled with moisture. Once sterile corridors took on the hush of a tomb, but a warm, private tomb, a place in which the walls remembered the touch of hands and answered with a slow, breathing heat. At first the small things multiplied, more coughs, more condensate, more green films in the corners of visors. Then things of scale shifted. Compartments were quarantined, then sealed. Doors once open to the tides of movement were bolted shut and padlocked with tight ceremonial knots. Men with liturgical calm pinned shreds of paper to bulkheads, lists of names, lists of rites to be recited, lists of observations, and then trudged on because ritual is also labor. The ship became an enormous, patient body, folding itself in on its own fever. When the plague erupted, it did so with the cheerful thoroughness of rot. Flesh softened as if warmth had convinced it to forget its former purposes. Where a tendon had once held a weight, it now let the weight sink and grow plumper, as if the world itself were teaching the muscle to relax. Cuts oozed slow, amber curds rather than sharp blood. Wounds knitted with crusts that were not scars but something like bark. Maggots, at first the size of a larval confession, crept through vents and slithered in the moist seams of piping like a secret network of small white priests. They tuned the air with their own tiny policy. They ate and they arranged. In the iron lungs of the vessel, they found a banquet and a choir. It is grotesque to imagine how mechanical things began to answer biological demands. Filters that once spat back clear, cold air now hummed and pushed out vapors that smelled sweet as old fruit. Pumps, retooled by necessity and by whatever will slick their engineering, began to expel not merely a flow but a melody, rhythms that matched the coughs and the sighs of the crew. Again and again the chant, mantra-thin, machine-thick, wove through the ship's veins. We endure, we endure. It gained depth and a new syllabic wetness until the words sounded like the throat clearing of a petulant god. The warp itself, always an unfriendly neighbor at the edge of any crossing, answered as if it had been waiting for permission. What had once been just a smear in local sensor space swelled, the sea rippling into a hand-sized window that fit against the hull like a pressed palm. Through that window there came a smell so unlike the sharp, burning smell of a warp spike. It was loam and rot and the afterbloom of a distant, verdant marsh. For a moment, one conduction of breath, it seemed less a corridor between realities and more a vista, green, vast, and indulgent. The men who looked into it saw meadows of the wrong color and flowers like swollen mouths. They felt, fleetingly, as though they had stumbled upon a garden that had been prepared for them. It is the small, intimate betrayals that stay with the living. A man will tell you he felt heat from his armor, the plates swollen like bellies. He will describe how a seam split, and from it came a smell like bread gone bad and perfume, two things that should not coexist. He will tell of the maggots, which seemed both vulgar and ordained, turning the innards of vents into loamy soil. He will tell of seeing something bloom from a dead hand, a flower pale as bone, its petals slick and shining, opening with a slow, luxurious motion as if to applaud the transformation. Men touched the bloom and found their fingers sticky with a nectar that tasted faintly of copper and of something sweet. Hunger, too, lived in that taste. Mortarion watched all of this. He watched with the measured attention that had been the hallmark of his life, an attention trained to note systems, to correct, to legislate. He listened to medics and to technicians, to the scholars who still kept records in cramped, nervous hands. He listened and he cataloged. He learned new names for old symptoms. He struck down some practices and allowed others. For a long, terrible interval, he wore the same face he had always worn, the plainsman's austerity, the ruler's long patience. But the warp has a grammar of its own. It speaks in several tongues and waits for the right consonant to be uttered. One night, or what passes for night aboard a sheaf of metal in a cold sky, the warp's window widened and the vessel shuddered as if with a hiccup. A smell, thick, green, and impossibly sweet, poured through an unsealed seam and slipped into the air like perfume. Men bent to breathe it and found themselves smiling without meaning to. The membrane between what they had known and what was being offered thinned to the consistency of tissue. Mortarion, who had long taught them to embrace endurance and to fashion a life of patient compromise, found himself kneeling. The moment of his kneeling was not an accusation but an elegy. He did not fall in the frenzied way of a man caught by a blade. He folded, like a ledger closed on a final entry. His crowding officers did not rush to haul him up. They watched with the reverent pause of witnesses to a sacrament. One by one, as if obedience were gravity, others bent their knees. It was not submission so much as a collective recognition, a leader accepting what the world had given him, and his men accepting that acceptance. Mortarion had preached a world without gods. Now he embraced one whose cathedral smelled of rot and rich earth. The change, literal and spiritual, was a transfiguration. The death guard, who had once been valorous in a particular stubbornness, found their stubbornness redirected. Acceptance, once discipline, became adoration. Where they had been trained to swallow pain as a tool, they now drank at a richer cup. Laughter emerged, wet and guttural, threaded with phlegm. They laughed in the midst of their own unmaking, and the sound had the shape of both release and great sorrow. Men wept with their mouths full of honeyed necrosis, and then wiped their faces with the same hands that fed the infection. Their voices lowered and deepened, until speech had the quality of a wet croak, each syllable carrying a bulk of meaning like something carrying a heavy tray. The physical transformations were not merely superficial. Plates fused into flesh with the imperturbable patience of creeping varnish. Where a plate met skin, cartilage gave way to a scabbed seam that sealed with a kind of proud bark. Armor bloated in places as if the metal, too, had learned to store life. In others, it contracted and recessed like a pulled mouth. Gas masks took on the faint, lachrymose impression of cheeks. Helmets fogged from within, and the fog would not clean, as if it were breathing its own private wet weather. Eyes took on a film like greenish milk. When a man lifted his face, the sheen caught the light and made him look as though he were always looking through water. Psychology followed anatomy. Acceptance had been their doctrine. Worship became its refinement. The God they did not name gently persistently offered them what the world had been helping them toward, an existence without the jag of panic, without the disruptive shock of sudden loss. The gift was a slow erasure of certain human edges, the quick laughter, the shocked intake, the impulsive grief. In its place there was a cultivated, communal serenity. Men no longer struck out in the frenzy of fear. Their touch, when given, was soft and almost reverent. They moved differently, less with the abruptness of survival, and more with the slow, ceremonial motions of a priesthood at prayer. The world that unfolded through the warp window was a garden, if such a profane, ancient word could be used. It pulsed with life that felt carved from the wrong root. Leaves quivered like tongues. Fungi glittered with dew like jewels. Magnificent rot was everywhere. Flowers with petals like sullied silk laughing their own slow joys. Trees whose bark had the sheen of old coins. Ponds where the water smiled and seemed to remember faces. Flies the size of fists buzzed with a lazy, indulgent noise, and alighted on skin where they were welcomed with a soft hand. The garden did not threaten as a predator might. It promised as a lover might. Touch me and you will be comfortable forever. Symbols, once the tools of discipline, then the instruments of decay, began to gather meaning anew. A bell, once distant in a corridor and used to mark the passing of shift, reappeared in dreams and then on a mast, muffled now by the growth of lichen and the slow pulp of rot. When it rang, the sound came not as an alarm but as a call to a feast. The bell's tone was low and wet. It told of small, celebratory deaths and understated ascensions. Elsewhere, a single flower, one intimately associated with a particular fallen sergeant, bloomed from a corpse in the hold, pushing through ribs like a sprout through frost. It opened its petals slowly as if in applause, and men lined up to touch it and feel the life in their fingers returning in a new vocabulary. There were grotesqueries too, because the garden did not erase the truth of mortality but reworked it. Flesh would slump and then reformat like clay. Wounds that once resembled tragedy now matured into ornate displays of nature's obstinacy. Fist-sized galls that pulsed like small hearts, nodules that sang faint, tuneless notes when thumbed, pustules that opened not in splatter but in careful, unfurling petals. Maggots multiplied into swarms that moved in patterns, cooperative, almost orchestrated, tearing at a wound and then, with hunger sated, aligning themselves into a ring that spun like a slow carousel. The sight was both repellent and enthralling, like watching a ritual one half remembered. While some elements of horror arrived as spectacle, the deepest terror came as surrender. The mental conversion of a people who had once prized autonomy into a choir that observed its new rites with the same seriousness they had once given to drills. The will, Mortarion's watchword, was not destroy. It bent. Men found strength in the decision to be claimed. The complexity of choosing to be claimed is its own cruelty. When a man chooses to kneel before a god who promises perfect endurance, he retains an element of agency even as he loses his independence. The final horror is not the absence of will, but the voluntary rechanneling of will towards something that erases what was loved. Outsiders who watched, rare now, for the death guard had closed their roll, found themselves bewildered by the odd tenderness of the process. They would see a veteran gently remove a maggot from the wound of a comrade and stroke it almost affectionately as if calming a pet. They would hear a hymn that began as a maintenance checklist and had become a psalm of rust and rot. They would watch a man laugh till he coughed and then smile as though at a private joke. Those who observed often reported a feeling like vertigo, the recognition that the men were not merely victims but worshippers, not merely decayed but anointed. There were episodes of counterforce, small and desperate. A squadron of brothers once tried to purge a hold with harsh chemical fire, to sterilize and reclaim the steel with the violent simplicity of flame. They lined up canisters along a corridor and opened valves. They intended to burn the fungus back to bare iron, but the vapors produced phenomena unexpected by their calculations. Instead of scouring the rot away, the heat coaxed a new richness from it, spores that rose like confetti and seeded keloids of brighter, brassier fungus. The attempt to cleanse became a perverse fertilization. The men watching the spread of new life felt a twinned horror and awe, like a parent watching a child transgress a law with a grin. Mortarion's final public moments before absolute submission were not cinematic in the way recorders preferred. There was no single image to capture the conversion, no bolt of lightning, no dramatic revelation. Rather, there was a slow folding of ritual, the recitation of old rosters, the changing of insignia into patterns that resembled lichen, the deliberate burying of some banners, and the careful wet pressing of others into the sick earth of the hold. He walked among his followers like a gardener, passing through a field he had planted, and now allowed to flourish in a way that looked nothing like the seed he remembered sowing. He stood before the warp window, and in a moment that might be described as either clarity or capitulation, stretched a hand into the pale green light. The light accepted and did not burn. What transpired next was less a change than a consummation. Where before there had been wrestling between the old laws of war and the new laws of rot, now there was a joining. Mortarion's knees went down, and the Legion followed, as if gravity had turned its face. They knelt in rows amongst the breathing vents and the clotted puddles and the buzzing swarms. The garden reached its fingers in and touched them with textures that tasted like honey and iron. The men let themselves be enfolded. They were not robbed of feeling in an obvious sense. They felt warmth and pain and amusement and deep comfort. They laughed with throats changed into gurgles and sang with throats altered into bellows. Tears flowed through beards into the grooves of armor and left tracks that glowed faintly with bioluminescent residue. They experienced a joy so vast and particular it seemed to transform grief into a new instrument. Their language retooled to pronounce new blessings, not for conquest or honor, but for putrescence that sustained life, for bellies that would never want, for wounds that would seal into new forms. As the Legion embraced, some things were lost that could not be retrieved. Names that had once been tender, mother, sister, field, fell into new contexts. To call to mind a girl's laugh and a green bloom in the same breath became natural. Memory itself folded into the new theology. They kept traces, small and private, like relics pressed into pouches. A child's wooden horse that had been varnished by someone's hand with a slow, careful tenderness. A scrap of cloth embroidered with a lover's name. A photograph stuck into a locker now rhymed with mildew. These were kept and caressed on long nights, but the hands that caressed were often damp, and their attentions had the sheen of ritual more than of longing. The broader galaxy turned in its indifferent orbit. Some called them blasphemers. Others called them blessed. Few understood that the Death Guard had not been forcibly turned so much as invited into a perfection of their own creed. They had loved endurance, and in that love they had found a God that answered in the same currency. The gift had been tailor-made. In the crescendo of horror there was no grand defeat because there had been no grand resistance to begin with. The Legion folded into its garden like a plant into the soil that matches its seeds. They laughed through phlegm and tears. They accepted with a fervor that shimmered with joy and quiet hunger. Their humanity did not vanish like smoke. It dissolved, rearranged into praise. Mortarion's oath had been to will alone. His final prayer, muttered with a voice now scored with wet croaks and low bellows, sounded more like gratitude than denial. As the bell, muffled and dripping, rang again and again, its tone became the example of a life changed into liturgy. The sound slid through the metal and the water and the breathed fungi, and settled into bones like a slow, gilded ring. Outside the ship, the warp window pulsed like the chest of a sleeping beast, and somewhere beyond it the garden shifted its light, pleased at the harvest. The Death Guard had become something new and dreadful and oddly tender, a legion that worshipped Decay because Decay had promised them the one thing they had always wanted, unbrokenness, however warped the price. When at last the hull sighs and the warp lock releases, the sensation is not triumph but a long, wet exhalation, as if something vast and patient has finally been allowed to breathe out. For a single, stupid moment the crew who still call themselves mortals, those whose names remain unchanged in the worn ledgers, expect a clean, surgical emergence. Sensors clear and lights true, the engines whispering as if apologizing for the violence of the crossing. They expect because expectation is comfortable. They hope, because hope is a small, stubborn risk they allowed themselves when they were still human. What they find instead is a rebirth in filth. The viewport fractures into a vista that is both obscene and tender. Their ship, once a disciplined line of steel and light, now seems to have been exhaled from a throat that prefers rot. The world that fills their vision is a planet stitched together from decay and carnival. Swells of fungus rise like cities. Rivers that might have been sweet water are syrup and sap and something thicker. It moves, and the cameras beam it back in viscera-colored strips. The clouds are not white but the bruised, green amber of old honey gone wrong. And when the sun, if it can still be called that, pushes through, its light is refracted into a sickly, celebratory glow that paints every surface like a stage. It smells first. The nose cannot take in the image without the voice of scent preceding it. A sweetness so deep and saturated it seduces the memory. It is the perfume of fruit long left to swell on a heat that is not solar. It is the smell of compost that knows how to turn the world into something else. Beneath it, like an undercurrent, the bitter iron of blood and the acrid acid of burnt oil mingle and make a single, complex note. Men press palms to the viewports and breathe as if in a trance, tasting the planet in their mouths as if the skin of the ship were a membrane through which the world might be sampled. The buzzing comes next, not a distant nuisance but a symphony. Flies of unnatural size sail in lazy orbits and fill the audio feed with a soft, buzzing chorus that could be mistaken for distant worship. Their bodies catch the sick light and bloom like a constellation of moving coins. They alight upon the hull in clusters and seam. And this is the first thing that makes men laugh with a sound that tastes of panic and joy to leave behind. Where they settle, a faint ring of luminous residue, a trace that glows for a breath. The residue is not mere detritus. It is a signature, a seal. Wherever a fly has been, life seems to tilt toward the planet's grammar, hospitality to the rot and gratitude. Outside, the atmosphere moves with the lazy, confident rhythms of something that has rehearsed ruin for generations. Gales laden with spore and glitter buffet the ship, and small, dark motes sift through even strengthened seals like confetti. Instruments claim anomalies in dry, professional strings of data. Medics read them and feel only a peculiar, private thrill. The data suggests that the air is rich with strange enzymes that will not simply drift past, but will remember contact, will write themselves into the molecules of whatever they meet. The sensors that measured the human respiratory capacity now sing of change. Inside, the ship answers to the outside by replying in kind. Condensate beads on panels like dewdrops. Where it hits cloth it stains, not with ordinary mildew, but with patterns that seem almost intentional. Swirls and sigils made of grime. The life support systems that had once maintained their purity now cough in cadence. And the pumps pump not only cool, regulated air, but a faint, sweet mist that fogs visors with patterns like hieroglyphs. The lights, dimmed in prudence for re-entry, flare and halo. Shadows thicken and pulse as if something beneath their surface is moving. Men wake on racks with small, pleasant twitches on the tongues, as if they have just tasted nectar and realized they are allowed to like it. Mortarion stands in the bridge's dimness like an old statue that has woken. He is not immobile in the way carved stone is immobile. He moves with a deliberate slowness that suggests he has learned new muscles. There is putrescence at his collar where sweat and oil and something else have coagulated into a film that glints like the patina on a saint's reliquary. Flies attend him with a courtesan's devotion, landing along the folds of his cloak as if threading rosary beads through fabric. When they rise, they leave a faint halo over the close-shorn hair of his temples. He does not swat them away. He cups a palm and lets their weight settle and then lifts his hand like a priest lifting bread. Around him, the men, the legionnaires, the keepers of a creed built on hard will, obey a gravity that is more than physical. The ship's decks have become a kind of nave where the secret rituals of biological faith are enacted, where mortal engineers once checked tolerances. Now hands of those same engineers move in gestures that are partly technical and partly liturgical, tightening a valve, laying a smear, reciting a maintenance checklist that doubles as prayer. The words loop back into themselves, and the cadence converts into praise. They land, and the plash of atmosphere on hull is a new percussion. Engines, those harsh beasts of burning metal, moan and lower themselves like exhausted beasts relieved of burdens. Airlocks crack open with a hiss that could be a long inhalation, and a scent rolls in that makes men stagger with a sudden, childish need. It smells like syrup and old spice, and honey steeped too long in a dark place. It smells like memory turned into a physical thing, like every kitchen on a childhood planet left to ferment and conspire. The planet beneath is a horror and a home. Fields of fungal growth ripple like seas. Great blossom trees bear pods that wobble with internal motion. Rivers drag along viscous currents whose surfaces are an unctuous gloss, reflecting the sky in colors that should have no right to harmonize. Great swarms of insects and winged things drift in the air, turning the skies into flurries of applause. From a distance, if one squints and allows pity to shade vision, one might see structures that are almost architectural spires of calcified growth, arches of woven mycelium, like cities that matured by neglect and then decided to bloom. They step onto the soil, and it gives with a warmth like a mattress and a squelch like a wound eased by ointment. Their boots sink and find purchase in an earth that remembers hands not in dryness but in soaking. The ground drinks and then grins. Men who have always been trained not to look surprised find themselves melting into squeals of wonder that become coughs, and then incantations. Praise, someone says at first, and the word unfolds into many. Praise for endurance, praise for the relief of worry, praise for a planet that will feed their wounds and teach them sweetness. Mortarion is crowned, in the slowest, most intimate ceremony the world has ever seen. The crown is not diadem nor forged circlet, but a halo that the flies compose by choosing him as a focal point. They gather and weave themselves into a shifting corona, the sweep of their bodies creating a crown of motion rather than metal. As they land along his brow, they leave a film of dust that glows faintly with bioluminescent spores, a living diadem. Men kneel and do not feel the indignity of bowing. In their bones, there is the recognition that their leader has been given back to them in a new form. He is their conduit now, their figure in which their faith is concentrated and redistributed. Mortarion takes his place and breathes in the perfume of the planet, and for the first time since his childhood on Barbarus, he laughs, a clean, terrible sound with the shape of acceptance. The purpose that has always been a quiet truth, to hold, to be unbroken, reveals itself in its final architecture. They are to spread the gift. It is not announced with trumpets or manifestos. Instead, it is whispered and then recited as if it were a maintenance list. We will carry the harvest, says one, and the word is embroidered by a dozen others. We will lodge it in the hearts of worlds. The plan is almost pedagogical, to move from place to place, to bring the soil and the air and the seeds, to press them into the wounds of planets like bandages dipped in loam. The gift is framed as mercy, to give a world the thing they now worship, the slow, enduring life of the rot, the immunity to sudden ruin that the planet promises. And then, as if to mark the transformation with a sound that is more liturgical than bureaucratic, someone tolls a bell. The bell is old and wet. It rings not as a clean chime, but as a sonorous, muffled knell that sits in the chest. The sound moves through the air like a finger through honey. It is an offering and an invocation. The men chant in reply, and their voices have found new timbre, deeper, wet-hedged, layered with phlegm and laughter. Their songs are not laments. They are benedictions. They sing the names of those who have gone before, and include in the litany the names of the things that were lost to make room for this new life. There is one who does not yet accept. He is the last man who carries the clarity of an old world in his mouth, not merely an old face, but a memory of edges sharp enough to cut the patience that has become their religion. He was once a captain, perhaps, or a medic, His hands know the business of repair more intimately than they know the art of liturgy. He stands in the hold, among the low-murmuring throng, watching the processions and the flowers that blossom in places where necrotic tissue was scraped away and allowed to be fed. He tastes the honeyed air and feels the old taste of copper like a warning in his gums. "This isn't what we wanted," he screams, a thin, human sound that cracks against the cathedral of insect song and the soft, wet chants. The words are raw and bright as a struck flint, and for a breath the sound creates a cleft in the chorus. He repeats it, voice rasping with effort, and he hears his own syllables as if through distant water. For an instant there is a momentary fissure in the dream. Men who have been kneeling look up. Some feel a ripple of guilt like a muscle they do not control. Others smile with the private joy of being affirmed in a righteous conversion. A few, rare, clutch at the seams of their memories and taste the old epithets. But what happens next is the cruel anatomy of their choice. Even this resistance is absorbed. From the vents and from the sky comes an answer that is not a scream and not a shout but a laugh. Nurgle's laughter. It is not a laugh like a jester's. It is a laugh like a sky relieved of a boil. It is gentle and vast and final, a sound that contains pity and pride, and a finality almost like benediction. It is the laugh of one who has listened for a long time, and now finds that the world has finally arrived in the appointed shape. "You asked for endurance," the air seems to say, using the cadence their training taught them. "I gave it to you." The laugh follows and folds around the sentence, making it not a statement but a kind of caress. There is no malice in it, only an infuriating warmth. The resistance thins and slides away. The last man's scream becomes a small, private noise like a dropped tool. They spread then, not as conquerors but as sowers. Devices once meant to sterilize become carriers of seed. They pass through systems and leave behind not only the spores and enzymes, but the rituals of acceptance. A psalm written into a maintenance checklist. A bandage soaked in sweet sap. Planets that once prided themselves on clarity and order find at their cores the slow acceptance of the new grammar. Cities reduce their cleaning rites to ceremonial performs that no one can fully explain. Armies that would have raised an invading host to ash now hesitate, their training rebadged as a catechism of endurance. The sensory overload is continuous and complete. The buzzing is everywhere, a constant canopy that shadows the thought. There is a thick sweetness beneath everything that cramps the nostrils and then becomes a flavor on the tongue. Blood and honey. When men taste it, they feel the world in their mouths as if the planet were a convex mirror, and their tongues the first instruments to read it. Sometimes they weep from the richness of sensation. Sometimes they laugh, and it sounds like small bells falling into a sink of syrup. Immortality arrives not as a god's boon but as a biological contract. Wounds cease to kill. Disease reconfigures itself into a pattern that becomes life. Cells learn to reproduce not with the readable chaos of ordinary illness, but with a choreography that centers on persistence. Tissue reforms in ways that prevent fatal collapse. They do not age in the arithmetic way of the bodies that came before. They persist in a mode that is not life as humans know it, but continuity as a material quality. The last man watches peers stitch themselves into new shapes, eyes clouded into unblinking discs that nevertheless seem to see more than sight, mouths that unfurl into petal-like smiles. And he feels, with the last of his human clarity, the real price. The clean life is gone. They are immortal, but they will never be clean again. Clean is not merely hygiene. It is the state of being able to be surprised into joy or wrecked into sorrow. Clean is the possibility that pain will force a response and choice will respond in kind. The gift that the garden bestows removes that frontier. The men find they cannot be undone by sudden cataclysms. Their tendons reconfigure. Their marrow refuses collapse. But something else, that tight point of being that is named by private scent and the sting of sudden grief, is gone, softened by the eternal sweet. They will not die, but they will not taste the sharpness of being alive as before. The world will no longer know them as they once were. Their names will remain on files, but the living syllable of a name is a different thing. Mortarion stands crowned and radiant in the wet dark of his new court. He laughs, and it is a sound like old wood given varnish, and then set alight, strange, protective, and utterly unafraid. He looks upon his legion, and his eyes, clouded with the green film that marks his new sight, shine as if with a devotion that is both parental and predatory. He is the gardener and the harvest. He tends and is tended. He has become a conduit through which the gift moves outward, a conduit loved by the thing that has loved him. As worlds fall beneath their slow ministrations, as cities fold their rituals into the new liturgy, the galaxy learns to whisper about them in private rooms and in public squares, and the whispers are many. Apocalyptic, reverent, terrified, awed. Some say the Death Guard are angels of endurance. Some call them demons. Some say they are neither, and in that last pronouncement there is a precise, small horror. They are simply what their creed made of them. They are the perfection of their own desire, and it is monstrous. In the fevered ecstasy of the final reveal, the Legion sings into their new eternity. Their voices, thick with consumption and joy, issue forth not in rage but in praise. They have given up the thing they thought they wanted, an unbreakable will that remained human, for something more absolute, a continual, implacable persistence that will not end, but will not return them to their old contours. The last mortal's scream becomes a legend. Children coaxed into adulthood in a softened galaxy will recite it as a caution or as a charm. It will be an element in the litany. This isn't what we wanted. The phrase will be set like a stone in the foundation of a new story. Sometimes, late in the night, if a wind from the plague planet reaches far and makes a distant lamp flicker, a listener will imagine they hear, threading through the insect chorus, a laugh both gentle and final. It is a laugh that says, in the end, with a voice both ancient and cushioned, "You asked for endurance, I gave it to you." They have become immortal, and they will never be clean again. The stars withdrew like polite guests at a feast that had gone on too long. One by one, their sharp lights blinked and softened beneath a haze that smelled of wet earth and old honey, until the sky itself seemed to have been varnished with a slow, greenish sheen. Where constellations had once been maps and promises, there were now only the faint, familiar silhouettes of long voyages and the soft, obscene bloom of something that did not care for names. Night folded into something else, a dusk that never quite decided whether to end. A ceiling pressed low and patient above the hulls of ships that had not known sleep for an age. Across the metal ribs of those vessels, rust grew like a scripture. It wrote itself into panels and rivets, and the seams where men once trusted the world to be immutable. The sound of maintenance, once brisk, pragmatic, soothes a life that must continue, became ritual recitation, a litany of tightening bolts and smearing salves. The hands that performed the tasks were steady, trained to be steady. Their steadiness became a kind of prayer. They moved in slow arcs, in gestures that had become more than function. The same actions repeated until repetition itself was sanctified. Ships drifted then, not because engines failed, but because engines had found a tempo that matched a new ecology. They floated like vessels in a great, sullen tide, carrying their gardens and their bellies and their hymns across an indifferent galaxy. Their navlights, which once blinked like obedient stars, now cast halos in the condensation that formed on viewports. The condensation crawled in microvegetative patterns and then pooled into small, gleaming lakes in crevices. Men leaned upon rails and watched these pools and sensed, with a calm that was nearly pious, that something patient lay beneath the surface of everything they touched. Memory blurred at the edges. The galaxy, which keeps its own ledger in the hush between wars, had begun to forget faces. It is not that records were erased. Written names remained on paper and in data rings, but the living inflections that made a name a person, the sudden hitch of a laugh, the startled cry at a comet's passing, the private, small betrayals of love, these softened and unstitched. Old friends passed one another in mess halls, and nodded in that untroubled way of people who had been long together. They did not always find the spark that had once made a joke land like a small stone, causing ripples. The galaxy stored them as facts. Veteran, Captain Medic. But what it forget was the quickness of a glance and the wrongness of a hand that used to clap in anger and now stroked a swollen wound like a rosary. Out beyond the echo of current wars, entire systems learned to speak of the Death Guard in peculiar plural tongues. To some, they were salvation, an unstoppable, patient remedy that kept cities from sudden annihilation. To others, they were plague bringers, a deliberate fungus that ate the edges off a civilization until that civilization could be coaxed into a new grammar. Most of the voices in between did not call them either. They called them weather. They spoke of them in the same tone used to recount a season. It comes, it lingers, it changes the shape of what will grow afterward. The living remembered in that way, but only as climate remembers the rain. For the men who had become the Death Guard, the persistence was everything, and everything was persistence. The rot that had once been a horror was now an ongoing liturgy. They kept their relics, small shreds of child laughter, a mother's braid turned to a damp strip of cloth, and they pressed these tokens against wounds that would not close in any old way. They fed them with the slow slurp of the planet's balms, and sealed them with crusting salves that smelled faintly of spice and iron. These careful, private ministrations were acts of love refrained. They were the last tender practices of a species refusing to be entirely erased. The soundscape of their drifting was dominated by bells. Bells hammered a low, sonorous time against the metal ribs and the damp air. They hung from frames and masts, from hands and the throats of creatures that now shared their world. They did not ring like alarms but like calls. Be here, be present, be fed. Their tone was thick with moisture and memory. Each toll left a residue on the listener's chest, a place that one could rub and recall the feeling of a childhood field at dusk. The bells moved through the corridors and into the engine rooms, into the crannies where bacteria and myth grow together. They were the slow punctuation to a language of endurance. What persisted, too, were the small contradictions. Men hummed while they worked and grinned when the harvests of rot were bountiful. They wept at funerals that had always ended in laughter. They held fast to the tallies of what had been given and what had been taken, as if moral accounting could be written into bone. They lied to one another, sometimes, in the gentle ways of people who must imagine meaning to survive, saying we were chosen when they had been enrolled, saying we are blessed when they had been altered. The lies were soft and low. They kept the body functioning and the mind wrapped in a quilt of stories. The rot itself matured into rites, where once surgeons cut and sewed with cold steel. Now careful hands coaxed new growth with warm brine, arranging pustules and nodules as though arranging flowers. A scab became a petal in a wall hanging of history. A gangrenous growth set in a particular pattern was revered as a mark of passage. Young recruits arrived with the bright reluctance of those who hope they will never forget what they started as. By the time their hands had learned to pray with salves, they could hardly tell which memory was their own and which had been cultivated for them. The rite of passage passed, the ritual taking its shape until even memory seemed like an artifact placed for future generations to touch and be instructed by. Outside, the galaxy turned its head with a distant, bureaucratic shrug. Empires wrote dispatches and folded them into communication tubes. Ambassadors came to parley and went away deciding to wait. Wars flared and were acted on with the grim, pragmatic skills of those who had to manage more than myth. Some governments attempted quarantines, fences of flame and coded silence. But containment in politics is a trickier thing than containment in biology. Ideas leak. Seeds travel. Even the most ardent architect of separation learns, through the patient work of weather and commerce and the oddity of human kindness, that a stray spore can cross 100 borders in a single breath. In the quiet corridors where lamps were dimmed and damp, there were people who kept vigil. They watched the men, their friends, their brothers, their former selves, in the deep hours and read what remained of them as an elegy. They thumbed texts and found their old doctrines annotated in green scripts. They placed their palms against the cold of a hull and imagined warmth. Some of them began to write songs, low and rolling tunes about endurance and the price of promises. These songs were sung in voices that had learned to make beauty from the grotesque, with lines that matched the bell toll. We endure, we spread, we plant. They were lullabies and warnings at once, a music that could be taught to children whose teeth had not yet hardened. The garden that had taken their hearts remained an ecology older than any single legion. It fed, it spread, and it learned its own rhythms. It pulsed in throb and blossom, in putrescence and perfume, and it kept time to the tolling of its bells. From its dark soil came spores that rode trade winds and the hulls of craft. They settled in places not chosen, nested within the folds of a blanket, a strap, a buttered tongue of a trader who had stopped for tea and never suspected what he carried home. The galaxy, always porous, absorbed these seeds in increments. They took root in gutters and in the pores of cities. And so the terror at the end was not a single moment of catastrophe, but a long, inhabited change. It was the stitching of a new horizon line into the everyday. It was the way streets grew soft at the edges, where gutters once scoured the pavement clean. It was the way kitchens learned to cook an extra herb for the workers who liked it. It was the hush that fell when a bell tolled in some far, newly consecrated hold. The rot created patterns that were survivable and very often desirable. There were nights when the memory of what had been felt like a fever. In those hours, a man might remember a wind not thick with spores but clean and sharp, a laugh that cut like glass, the tiny, piercing joy of pain that chases away cowardice and leaves character. He might wake with the taste of copper on his tongue and set it to the small shrine propped in the corner of the mess. He might press the relic, some trivial human object, against his chest and whisper a name that the galaxy had decided was less and less likely to be repeated in public. These were acts of resistance small enough to vanish if attended by any other weight, but they kept something alive, a point of alternative truth that could not be catalogued by any bell. Still, the dominant movement remained. The Death Guard spread in the quiet way of weather. They came to a world like sailors bringing a strange cargo and over time made it their harbor. They covered battlefields with gardens that grew out of armor. They taught reverent mechanics the choreography of feeding a wound until it became bloom. They showed entire communities how to make a crust into a relic. And the galaxy, in its ceaseless churn, parceled them into its stories. Some told like warnings to children, others told as a necessary tale of survival in the new age. In the long wash that followed, the faces of the Death Guard slid from singularity to symbol. Monuments were raised by those who loved them or by those who feared them. Shrines were carved where the bells once chimed. Children learned to whisper the litany of endurance like a nursery rhyme. Places that had once bristled with clean edges, and the arrogance of certainty learned instead to make room for the soft, patient work of rot and repair. The bell became a sign not only of presence but of process, a sound that meant both feast and forgetting. Even as the world settled its new habit, one sound threaded itself through the clamor and the quiet, the breathing of the legion. It was not the sharp, finite breath of a mortal, but a long, articulated cadence of inhalation and exhalation that moved through hull and hold, through vents and chambers, through the very sinews of hull weld and bone. It was a presence that could be mistaken for the ship systems at first, for the ambient pulse of life aboard a craft, but hearable if you paused in a corridor and tilted your head like an animal listening for rain. In the deep of night, when the bells stilled and the garden's laughter sulked like a dream, you could stand very still and catch that breathing, soft, warm, patient, tracing patterns against metal like a hand against a cheek. The final whisper of the tale is small and close, meant to curl into the listener's ear as a benediction and a threat at once. It is a voice that does not shout across battlefields but leans in while you are checking a latch, while your back is turned in the dark. It speaks of endurance not as a virtue to be proudly held, but as a condition that now reaches outward like a tide. They endure, they spread, they sleep, yet never rest. And if you listen closely, you can still hear them breathing in the dark behind the rusting walls of time. Even now, they are watching, and their breath is warm on your neck,